Four young men vanished within days of each other in the summer of 2017. All were in their early 20s. All had bright futures ahead of them. And all were last seen with the same person, Cosmo DiNardo. But the way the truth finally came out still leaves investigators shaken to this day. Imagine your child leaving home for what seems like a simple meet-up with a friend. Hours pass, then days. Your calls go straight to voicemail. Their social media falls silent. What would you do when hope starts to slip away and the unthinkable becomes reality? This isn't just the story of a brutal killer hiding behind privilege and wealth. This is about betrayal, deception, and how a tight-knit Pennsylvania community uncovered one of the state's darkest crimes. You'll discover how a family farm became a graveyard, how a confession shocked even seasoned detectives, and how four families were forever changed by secrets buried beneath the soil. But first, let me take you back to July 2017, when four separate disappearances would soon reveal a connection so sinister it would haunt Bucks County forever. July 5, 2017. 19-year-old Dean Finocchiaro kissed his mother goodbye and told her he was meeting a friend to buy marijuana. He was saving money for college, working at his family's construction business. Dean was known for his infectious smile and his dream of becoming an engineer. He drove off in his Honda Civic, expecting to be home for dinner. He never returned. July 7th, 2 days later, 21-year-old Tom Mio, a recent college graduate with a degree in psychology, told his girlfriend he was going to sell marijuana to someone he'd met through mutual friends. Tom was passionate about helping others and had plans to pursue a master's degree. His family described him as cautious, responsible. He wouldn't just disappear without a word. But that's exactly what happened. July 9th. Mark Sturgis, 22, and his best friend Jimmy Patrick, 19, left together for what they believed was a quick transaction, selling a small amount of marijuana. Mark was a loving father to his 4-year-old daughter. Jimmy was known for his loyalty to friends and his infectious laugh. Both were trying to make a little extra money during the summer. Neither Mark nor Jimmy would ever see their families again. At first, police treated each case separately. Young men sometimes disappear for a few days. Maybe they got in trouble. Maybe they were too embarrassed to call home. But as the hours turned into days, and the days stretched on without a single text message, phone call, or social media post from any of the four, their families knew something was terribly wrong. The desperate search began. Flyers were posted. Social media campaigns launched. Volunteers combed through local parks and wooded areas. And slowly, investigators began to notice something chilling. Every single disappearance seemed to circle back to the same name, Cosmo DiNardo. But who was this young man that four separate victims had been in contact with? And why did everyone who knew him describe him as troubled, unpredictable, and dangerous? Cosmo DiNardo had everything most young men his age could only dream of. Born into wealth in 1996, he grew up on his family's sprawling 57-acre farm in Solebury Township, one of the most affluent areas of Bucks County, Pennsylvania. His parents owned multiple businesses and properties. Cosmo drove expensive cars, had access to unlimited money, and lived a life free from the financial pressures that motivated his victims. But beneath the privilege lay a darkness that few understood. From an early age, Cosmo struggled with severe mental health issues. He'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had a history of violent behavior that his family tried desperately to manage. Those who knew him described sudden mood swings, paranoid episodes, and an obsession with firearms that made people uncomfortable. In high school, Cosmo was known for bizarre behavior and explosive anger. He bragged about having access to weapons and often spoke about violence in casual conversation. Teachers and classmates noticed his disconnection from reality, but his family's wealth and status seemed to shield him from consequences. By 2017, at 20 years old, Cosmo had already been arrested multiple times for various offenses, including charges related to firearms and making terrorist threats. But each time, his family's lawyers managed to get charges reduced or dropped. To those around him, it seemed like Cosmo DiNardo could get away with anything. What they didn't know was that Cosmo had begun selling marijuana as a way to lure potential victims. He didn't need the money. This was something else entirely. Something much more sinister. Friends later recalled how Cosmo would become fixated on people he met, studying their routines, learning their vulnerabilities. He had a particular interest in young men around his age, especially those who seemed trusting or desperate for easy money. But Cosmo wasn't the kind of person people expected to snap into violence. His privilege, his family's reputation, his clean-cut appearance, all of it served as the perfect mask for what was brewing beneath the surface. And that mask was about to slip in the most horrific way imaginable. The DiNardo family farm, where Cosmo lived, would soon become the center of an investigation that would shock an entire community. What happens next would change everything. The DiNardo family farm stretched across 57 acres of rolling Pennsylvania countryside in Solebury Township. To anyone driving past, it looked like a pastoral paradise, vast open fields, dense woodlands, and the kind of privacy that money could buy. The main house sat far back from the road, hidden by trees and accessible only by a long, winding driveway. But this wasn't just any farm. The property had a darker purpose that the DiNardo family never intended. Cosmo had spent years exploring every acre of the land. He knew where the soil was softest, where the trees grew thickest, where someone could work without being seen from the main house or the road. He had access to heavy machinery, backhoes, excavators, and other equipment used for legitimate farm work, but perfect for more sinister purposes. The property included several buildings, barns, storage sheds, and workshops that could muffle sounds. There were burn piles where trash and farm debris were regularly incinerated, meaning the smell of something burning wouldn't raise suspicion from neighbors or family members. Most importantly, the farm offered complete isolation. The nearest neighbors were hundreds of yards away, separated by thick woods. Even if someone screamed, even if shots were fired, the sounds would be swallowed by the vast open spaces and forest. This was Cosmo's playground, and he had been planning how to use it. In the weeks leading up to July 2017, neighbors occasionally noticed unusual activity on the DiNardo property. Heavy machinery running at odd hours. The smell of fires burning longer than usual. Cars coming and going late at night. But in a rural area where farm work often extended into evening hours, none of this seemed particularly suspicious. Cosmo's parents, Antonio and Sandra DiNardo, were often away on business trips, leaving their troubled son alone on the property for days at a time. They thought the isolation and responsibility of maintaining the farm might be good for him, might give him purpose and structure. They had no idea their son was using their family land to commit unspeakable acts. Beneath the peaceful exterior of rolling fields and grazing areas, the soil would soon reveal its horrific secrets. But first, investigators needed to connect the dots between 4 missing young men and the wealthy young man who had been in contact with all of them. The breakthrough would come from an unexpected source, and what police discovered would turn this quiet farm into a crime scene that would haunt everyone involved. By July 12, 2017, 3 days after Mark and Jimmy had vanished, the families could no longer deny that something terrible had happened. 4 young men from the same general area, all disappearing within a week of each other. This wasn't coincidence. Detective Chief Joe Barbarella of the Bucks County District Attorney's Office took over the investigation. A veteran investigator with decades of experience, Barbarella had seen missing persons cases turn into homicides before, but something about this felt different, more urgent, more sinister. The first major breakthrough came from cell phone data. All 4 victims' phones had stopped transmitting signals in the same general area, near the rural townships of Solebury and New Hope. More specifically, the last pings from their devices all pointed toward the same isolated stretch of farmland. Dean's Honda Civic was found abandoned at Peddler's Village, a shopping center about 4 miles from the DiNardo farm. The car showed no signs of struggle, but Dean's wallet, keys, and phone were missing. Security cameras captured Dean arriving at the shopping center but never showed him leaving. Meanwhile, investigators began interviewing friends and family members of the missing men. A pattern emerged that sent chills down their spines. Each victim had told someone they were going to buy or sell marijuana. Each had mentioned meeting someone named Cosmo, and each had expressed some nervousness about the transaction. Tom Mio's girlfriend remembered him, saying the buyer seemed a little off, but that the money was too good to pass up. Mark Sturgis had told his sister he was meeting someone at a farm, but would be back within a few hours. The investigation team worked around the clock, mapping out timelines, analyzing phone records, and conducting interviews. Sleep became a luxury they couldn't afford as pressure mounted from desperate families and a community demanding answers. On July 13th, investigators decided to pay Cosmo DiNardo a visit. What they found was a 20-year-old man who seemed strangely calm about being questioned in connection with 4 missing persons. Cosmo was polite, even helpful, but his story kept changing. First, he claimed he'd never met any of the missing men. Then he admitted to knowing Dean, but said they'd never met in person. Finally, he acknowledged meeting with Tom and the others, but insisted they'd all left his property safely. But Cosmo had made a critical mistake. When detectives asked to search his property, he initially agreed, the move of someone with nothing to hide. Then, suddenly, he changed his mind and demanded they get a warrant. That change of heart told investigators everything they needed to know. While waiting for the search warrant, police noticed something else troubling. Cosmo's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He seemed to be watching them constantly, checking his phone obsessively, and making calls to people he wouldn't identify. On July 13th, as the search warrant was being processed, Cosmo DiNardo made another crucial error. He was arrested on an unrelated firearms violation, possession of a shotgun and ammunition despite being prohibited from owning weapons due to previous mental health commitments. But this arrest would give investigators the leverage they needed to crack the case wide open. As Cosmo sat in jail that night, cadaver dogs and forensics teams prepared to descend on the DiNardo family farm. What they would find buried beneath the peaceful Pennsylvania countryside would exceed even their most horrific expectations. July 14th, 2017. Dawn broke gray and humid over the DiNardo farm as investigators assembled the largest search operation in Bucks County's recent history. Cadaver dogs, forensics experts, heavy machinery operators, and dozens of law enforcement officers prepared to methodically examine every inch of the 57-acre property. The families of the missing men gathered at a nearby command center, holding on to desperate hope while preparing for the worst possible news. At 10:30 a.m., the first cadaver dog hit on something. The dog, a German Shepherd trained to detect human remains, alerted handlers to an area near a large burn pile about 200 yards behind the main house. The soil looked recently disturbed, and there was an unusual depression in the ground roughly 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. Detective Chief Barbarilla made the decision to bring in excavation equipment. As the backhoe began removing layers of soil, the smell hit them first, a sickly sweet odor that experienced investigators recognized immediately. 20 minutes later, they found the first body. The remains were badly burned and hastily buried in what appeared to be a common grave. As forensics experts carefully excavated the site, they realized this wasn't just one victim. The positioning of bones, the amount of burned material, the size of the grave, everything indicated multiple bodies had been disposed of together. By 2 p.m., investigators had recovered partial remains of what appeared to be 3 individuals. The bodies had been burned so severely that identification would require dental records and DNA analysis. But based on personal items found at the scene, including a distinctive watch and wallet fragments, investigators believe they had found Dean Finocchiaro, Tom Mio, and Mark Sturgis. But where was Jimmy Patrick? As the search continued, a second cadaver dog alerted to another area of disturbed soil about 50 yards away. This grave was smaller, more hastily concealed, as if the killer had been pressed for time or growing more careless. The excavation of the second site began at 4:45 p.m. Within an hour, investigators had uncovered the remains of a 4th victim, buried alone and in significantly better condition than the others. The body appeared to have been killed more recently and disposed of with less planning. Dr. Samuel Galino, the county coroner, worked through the evening to begin the preliminary examination process. What he found painted a picture of violence that shocked even veteran law enforcement officers. Evidence at both burial sites indicated the victims had been shot multiple times. Shell casings found near the graves suggested a high-powered rifle had been used. The burn patterns on 3 of the bodies indicated accelerant had been used to try to destroy evidence. Most disturbing was the methodical nature of the disposal. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of panic. The killer had planned these murders, prepared the burial sites, and had the tools and knowledge to try to cover his tracks. As news of the discovery spread, the families were notified. The sounds of grief that echoed from the command center would haunt investigators for years to come. For families had lost their sons to unthinkable violence, and the entire community struggled to comprehend how such evil had festered in their quiet corner of Pennsylvania. But even with 4 bodies recovered, investigators knew their work was just beginning. They needed a confession. They needed to understand how and why this happened. And most importantly, they needed to determine if Cosmo DiNardo had acted alone. The answer would come from an unexpected source, Cosmo himself, who was about to make a deal that would reveal the full horrific scope of his crimes. July 15, 2017. With 4 bodies discovered on his family's property, Cosmo DiNardo's fate was sealed. But district attorneys needed details. They needed to understand how these murders happened, whether anyone else was involved, and most importantly, they needed to ensure they could secure convictions that would keep dangerous killers off the streets forever. Cosmo's attorney approached prosecutors with an offer that stunned everyone involved. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Cosmo would provide a complete confession to all 4 murders. What came next was 5 hours of testimony that chilled experienced investigators to their core. Cosmo described the murders with a detached, almost clinical precision that suggested no remorse whatsoever. He explained how he had used marijuana sales as a way to lure his victims to the isolated farm. Each killing followed a similar pattern. He would arrange to meet them for a transaction, get them alone on the property, then murder them with a .357 Magnum revolver and a rifle. Dean Finocchiaro was first. On July 5th, Cosmo lured him to the farm with the promise of selling him 4 pounds of marijuana for $8,000. Once Dean arrived and the transaction was supposed to take place, Cosmo shot him inside a barn, then moved his body to the burn pile area. 2 days later, Tom Mio met the same fate. Cosmo had convinced Tom he could make easy money by helping distribute marijuana to other buyers. When Tom arrived at the farm, Cosmo killed him and burned his body with Dean's remains. The double murder of Mark Sturgis and Jimmy Patrick was even more calculated. On July 9th, Cosmo arranged to sell them marijuana, but this time he wasn't alone. He had enlisted the help of his cousin, Sean Kratz, who was visiting the farm. According to Cosmo's confession, he and Sean killed both young men, then disposed of Mark and Jimmy's bodies differently. Mark was burned with the other victims, but Jimmy was buried separately in a hastily dug grave. But perhaps most disturbing was Cosmo's complete lack of emotion as he described these horrific acts. Investigators noted that he spoke about the murders the same way someone might describe their daily routine. There was no expression of guilt, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused 4 families. When asked why he committed these crimes, Cosmo's answer was as chilling as it was simple. He said he did it because he could. The isolation of the farm, his access to weapons, his family's wealth protecting him from consequences, all of it had created the perfect storm for a young man with severe mental illness to act on violent fantasies. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist who studied the case, later observed that Cosmo displayed classic signs of antisocial personality disorder combined with his diagnosed schizophrenia. The combination created someone capable of extreme violence without emotional connection to his victims. The confession solved the mystery of how 4 young men had vanished, but it raised new questions. How involved was Sean Kratz? Had there been other potential victims? And how had Cosmo's family missed the signs of such dangerous behavior? But investigators were about to discover that Cosmo's confession while complete, hadn't told the entire truth about his accomplice's role in these murders. Sean Kratz was arrested on July 15th, the same day as Cosmo's confession. At 20 years old, Sean was Cosmo's cousin and had been staying at the DiNardo farm during the time of the murders. But his role in the crimes was initially unclear. Unlike Cosmo, Sean immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to cooperate with investigators. This created tension between the cousins that would play out dramatically during the legal proceedings. The prosecution's case against Sean relied heavily on Cosmo's confession, which implicated him as an active participant in the murders of Mark Sturgis and Jimmy Patrick. But Sean's defense team argued that he was just another victim of Cosmo's manipulation, someone who had been coerced into helping dispose of bodies after the fact. During pre-trial hearings, a disturbing picture emerged of the relationship between the two cousins. Sean, while not diagnosed with severe mental illness like Cosmo, had his own history of drug use and poor decision-making. Friends described him as easily influenced and desperate to fit in with his wealthier, more confident cousin. The prosecution argued that regardless of Sean's motivations, he had actively participated in murder. Text messages recovered from his phone showed him discussing the cleanup after the killings, and physical evidence placed him at both burial sites. On February 5, 2019, Sean Kratz was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of Mark Sturgis and Jimmy Patrick. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Cosmo DiNardo, who had pled guilty to avoid the death penalty, received 4 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 30 to 60 years. He will never see freedom again. During the sentencing hearing, family members of the victims were given the opportunity to address both killers. Their statements were heart-wrenching testimonies to the lives that had been cut short and the permanent damage that had been inflicted on their families. Dean Finocchiaro's mother spoke about her son's dreams of becoming an engineer and helping build a better world. Tom Mio's father described his son's compassion and desire to help others through psychology. Mark Sturgis's daughter, now growing up without her father, was represented by family members who promised to keep his memory alive. Jimmy Patrick's friends spoke about his loyalty and the infectious joy he brought to everyone around him. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of weeping as these families tried to find words to express losses that couldn't truly be measured. Today, the DiNardo family farm sits empty, its buildings abandoned, and its fields left untended. The property has become a grim landmark, a reminder of how evil can hide behind privilege and how mental illness, left untreated and enabled, can lead to unthinkable tragedy. The families of Dean Finocchiaro, Tom Mio, Mark Sturgis, and Jimmy Patrick have worked to ensure their loved ones are remembered for their lives, not just their deaths. Scholarships have been established, memorial funds created, and awareness campaigns launched to help other families recognize warning signs of dangerous behavior. But questions remain that will never be fully answered. Could these murders have been prevented if Cosmo's mental health issues had been addressed more aggressively? Did his family's wealth and status prevent proper intervention? Were there other potential victims who narrowly escaped? The case forced law enforcement agencies to examine how they handle missing persons cases involving young adults. New protocols were established for coordinating multi-jurisdictional investigations and sharing information more quickly between departments. Most importantly, the murders of these 4 young men serve as a stark reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places. Cosmo DiNardo had every advantage in life: wealth, family support, opportunities that most people never receive. Yet he chose to use those advantages to commit horrific crimes against innocent people who were simply trying to make a little extra money. The true tragedy isn't just that 4 promising young lives were cut short. It's that their murders were completely preventable if one person had chosen compassion over violence, if mental health had been treated instead of hidden, if warning signs had been heeded instead of ignored. What do you think could have been done differently? Could these murders have been prevented? Or was Cosmo DiNardo simply too far gone to save? And what's the most shocking aspect of this case to you? The calculated nature of the murders, the role of privilege in hiding dangerous behavior, or the cold confession that showed no remorse? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story affected you, please subscribe for more in-depth true crime documentaries that examine not just what happened, but why it happened and what we can learn to prevent future tragedies.